Books like we know books to be.
But how did all of this information get lost, and why did it happen? Psychologist Naeem Akbar offers this explanation.
We came to America as a free people. In order for us to become slaves, it was necessary to destroy our consciousness of ourselves as independent human beings. That process was one by which you begin to destroy and to degrade those things which give you your sense of identity, purpose, direction, and origin. And in the process of doing so, you create a slave mind rather than a freed mind. And a constant onslaught of misinformation about who the slaves were was done intentionally for the purpose of making the slaves submissive and subject to the leadership of those authorities over them.
Much of Africa's history is wrapped around the glory of her kings, from the kingdoms of Kemet to the majesty of Mali and Songhai. African history developed around documented men and women. It's a comment about the power of racism and Western education that we rarely hear about these people or their countries. Who were some of these kings and queens? Dr. John Henrik Clark is a living library of resources in this area.
We know that Ghana lasted until 1000s. In the last of its many great kings, Tenkameni was killed 2 years before the Muslim invasion, 1076. So that means Tenkameni lasted until 1074. He was known as the king who rode out every day, twice a day. He would ride out and administer justice one part of the day. And no one had to move from his presence until he was satisfied that justice had been done in his case. He would ride out at the end of the day with dogs with gold collars, horses better dressed than the then kings of Europe, in splendid regalia.
At this point, we should let you know a little about the geography of ancient Africa. Ghana didn't have the boundaries it has today. In fact, according to Dr. Clark, none of present-day Ghana was a part of ancient Ghana. Dr. Clark says the boundaries of ancient Ghana look something like this. Again, we need to realize these kingdoms governed millions of people and had wealth. Wealth usually denotes commerce. Dr. Rosalind Jeffrey says the ancient Africans may have come up with the world's first calculator system to handle their daily transactions.
The old system in the marketplace was to put these little digits in a pan, and you would have your client come to you buying, purchasing perhaps little groupings of materials, a dozen of this, 2 dozen, etc. And meanwhile, someone takes away a dozen and this, that, and the other. Meanwhile, you're moving your disc around in a pan or in a basket. And so as you're moving around, they become your way of counting. So that modern society, we have our little hand calculator, right, with a little battery inside. And the old days, you know, ancient Mali, Ghana, Songhai, etc., they had a little basket where they were shuffling around little metal discs and at the same time, you know, doing their calculations this way.
As all worldly kingdoms do, Ghana began to decline. But as that happened, the neighboring country of Mali began to rise. Dr. Clark says Mali produced some of the greatest kings in world history.
After Sundiata, there was a servant king, Sakuru. And after Sakuru, the greatest of all the kings of Mali, Mansa Musa. And he came to power in 1306. In 1324, he went on a famous journey to Mecca and Medina because he was a Muslim. He spent all those years preparing. He took with him from 60 to 100,000 people, 50 hairdressers, and he only had his favorite wives.
How many of them?
Only the favorite wives went on the trip. They had 50 hairdressers.
Oh,
so you can guess how many wives were there. Now you talking about style. Now when we had it, baby.
Okay, so he left basically from northern Central Africa, is that correct?
Yes.
And then went all the way into Mecca.
Went to Egypt first, where he was crowned the great Caliph of the Western Sudan. mean, it's equivalent to Pope.
Right.
Then he went over to Mecca and Medina to pay his respects and gave alms and food and, you know, in fact, he took with him 250 camels, each with 250 pounds of gold each.
To give away.
To give away. And when he got back to Egypt, he was a little short of gold. And they put the entire treasure at his disposal. So you good for it. Take what you need.
Oh, man.
This is just for the trip home.
Did he marry into cities along the way?
He married his people, 50 of his people, into cities along the way, on his way. And on his way back, he said, we should not fight now because we're relatives. So it was a mission of peace. Now, this is no ordinary king. So no ordinary homecoming present is good for him. So while he was away, his local army captured the neighboring country.
Which was?
And Sangay. And gave him the country as a homecoming present.
That's amazing.
Now Timbuktu is under his control.
Which means the great libraries.
Not only the library of Timbuktu, but the great mosque at Sankore that he's going to turn into the University of Sankore.
And all of this is done by Africans, not Arabs.
No Arabs in sight.
We had African scholars. And once again, it's important to know the history because at this time, Islam had taken a stronghold particularly in parts of West Africa. So you had African scholars who had Arabic names in much the same way that we have European names. It doesn't mean we're not black, that we're not of African descent because we have European names. There are reasons why we have European names. But when we look into the history and we see somebody called Ahmed Baba, don't automatically assume that Ahmed Baba looks like the Egyptians that are in Egypt today. Ahmed Baba looked like you. Okay? We need to understand that.
Ms. Harris said it's important for school children to know about educated Africans such as Ahmed Baba. She also says it's important to remember that people such as Baba had their books destroyed.
They destroyed libraries. Ahmed Baba had a library, a personal library, that had over 1,600 books. It was destroyed.
Probably one of the saddest things about the loss of African culture is that many Africans don't even recognize things that are part of their history.
Dr. Rosalind Jeffrey says the ancient Africans carried these containers filled with writings and sayings. They were scriptures and parables important to them. So you could say they quite literally carried the written word on their hearts. Dr. Jeffrey's research has uncovered slave diaries. These books were discounted as memorization or pre-written Arabic script, but they're not. It's also not uncommon to find another obvious vestige of Black America's often overlooked African heritage, the call and response.
Call and response is a freedom of speech in its purest form. Every amen, each, teach now, sister, take your time. Every one of those right-ons, even the negative shake of the head, and if no more than the lift of that hand that goes back and forth, register that the response is there. Each response shapes and colors the call. This is a process that empowers all of us. And I'm going to tell you something. It's far less expensive than opinion polls. Now, you may have noticed that in certain settings, the dynamics of call and response is overlooked or misinterpreted. For example, white American moviegoers have been known to complain that the Bloods talk back to the movie screen. We sure do. Even after centuries of an aborted attempt to assimilate all that is our culture After centuries of misinformation, we African Americans still respond to the right calls.
The more accurate information gathered, the more likely it becomes to see cultural continuity for all African peoples. Unity in traditional black church services, where the call and response of songs echo back to the praise and response shouted before great African kings as they moved among their people.
I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad. All right, you got, let's do it now. We were in a strange land. We had been snatched from our homeland, raped of our culture, cut off from all that was familiar to us. But down there in the canebrake in the Brush Arbor, we continued to sing and moan and chant for freedom on the rhythm forms and musical idioms that were familiar to us from Mother Africa. Once we were introduced to this new language, we developed what has been called the Pidgin English of the slaves. And on those rhythm forms and musical idioms, after being introduced to this Jesus person, we developed that baseline music art form called the African American spiritual. That old time religion on Monday I got. That old time religion. I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad, I'm glad.
It's easy to show you comparisons of African cultural continuity in speech and writing and music. It's harder to compare social continuity in African American culture, but it does exist. Following some of the theories he gave us at the beginning of the program, Dr. Wade Nobles says many actions and gestures blacks take for granted actually show cultural continuity. Nobles also says that when a black woman puts her hand on her hip, she makes a gesture of righteousness that may date back to African culture as it was 5,000 years ago.
And we understand that that's intent that we can see in the grammar of our behavior. Isn't it interesting that this sign is the Mason Square? And in ancient Kemet, in the hieroglyphs, this sign represented righteousness. And so when sister puts her hand on her hip, she ain't just saying I got big hips and I can rest it here, even though that is true. She, in fact, is saying that there's a question of you being correct. You understand? And when she puts both hands on her hips, she's saying you doubly incorrect. You see? And so all we can say is, hey, I'm sorry. That's the sign. That's beginning to read and understand the intent of content. The content is the hands.
Africans are the only group of people who had to hide their heritage and who had the dominant society spend centuries trying to destroy that heritage. While some of that destruction did strip away surface ties, we hope the information presented in this half hour allows you to see all African culture did not die.
We know that African Americans, or African people, when they were brought to America, they weren't allowed to bring their cultural artifacts. They weren't allowed to bring the drum. They weren't allowed to bring the clothing. They weren't allowed to bring many things. But what they did bring, they were able to carry it in their minds and in their hearts. They were able to carry the rhythms. They were able to bring the stories. They were able to bring the patterns of speech. All of this we carried with us. And many people would like us to believe that once we were herded onto slave ships, that we left that on the seashore, on the shores of Africa. And that is so untrue. You know, when we look around us every day, we see remnants of our culture.
Earlier we showed you examples of Egyptian hieroglyphics and showed you similarities seen in West African scripts. These scripts suggest that African peoples may have migrated from the east to the west of the continent and beyond. We'll discuss those migrations and explain why they occurred in the next edition of African American Culture, A Second Look.
I asked you, my children, what did you learn today? Did anyone tell you how to meet tomorrow? Did anyone tell you why there are people who don't know you? Did anyone seem to know who you were? Did anyone know that you have the blood of Africa in your veins? Or did they pretend to be blind to your color and thereby deny its value? What did you learn? Did anyone explain the nature of freedom? Did anyone explain the nature of racism? Did anyone explain the nature of love? Did anyone know anything about these things? Did anybody know anything? What did you learn today?
And you go off in the bush, and all of a sudden you run into this little group of people they call Negrillos. How did they get there? You go to Guam, and you find a little group of people called Chimoros, little Moors. How did they get there? You go into Vietnam, and you find these black people in Vietnam. How did they get there? How did